So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the speaker for the 34th Gaddis Lecture. Thank you, Hannah, Pi Gamu President, for allowing me to butt ahead and do the introduction. Your speaker tonight is Christine Thompson-Schutt, as in shut the door. Her presentation is History Will Be Kind to Me, Thoughts on Museums, Silences, and the Power of Representation. As the program states, she is currently director of a major museum in the Kansas state system. I believe in her future there is a PhD of museology and a position at the Smithsonian Institution as director, not just one of the museums, but the whole thing. So you might ask students, how does this happen? She's a history major. That is synonymous with unemployed. Well, gee, I have had occasion to get to know her better than most, and I suggest her vibrant personality, her computer skills, and she's a damn good talker, so that goes a long ways. Most importantly, I think Christina came to Central with the intent of taking advantage of opportunities, and she had many of them here, and that's the gist of the introduction in the way that I'm going to present. Opportunities. She might have found these opportunities elsewhere at a different institution, maybe, but she found them here. To begin with, I get a chance to brag about her. She attended 3 statewide history conferences. She presented 2 papers, the first one being on the Free Black Militia in Louisiana Territory. Odd topic, but that's a good one. Her second was Missouri's involvement in the Second Seminole War at the Battle of Lake Okeechobee. This paper was submitted for publication, came back with favorable reviews, but by then she was in grad school and it's sitting in her inbox, no doubt. Sometime she'll get back to it, I would anticipate. But there is more to Christina than just the original research, and that's the reason why I mentioned this, is that you undergraduates can do original research here at Central. You don't have to wait until later. Christina also interned in New Orleans and Jefferson City, where she was the youngest student ever selected, the first Central student to work at the Missouri Supreme Court State Archives. She also attended National Leadership Forums in 2007, 8, 9, or 6, 7, 8, pick your pick. She attended Missouri's Governor's Leadership Forum in 2006 and 7, and by the way, she's a Gold Girl Scout Award from way back when. I could stop there, but the real Christina is involved in a lot more. She participated in plays, student government. She ran for student government president. She's in Pi Gamma Mu, Wesley Foundation, Alpha Phi Omega, and the list goes on. She was very, very active. And before I forget, she received the Selectman Award on graduation, only one of those given out. She then goes off to grad school to Simmons College in Boston, where she will intern at the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of the Massachusetts Historical Society, where she will also become a processing archivist at the Center for the History of Medicine at that other university that one call Harvard. After the MA in History and Library Science at Simmons, she's hired as a librarian archivist at Henry's College in Arkansas, and now she has her own museum. In the last 6 years, she's given 10 professional papers at national conferences. Odd titles like Zotero, and I'll spare you the rest of them. Along the way then, she gets married and starts doing the family thing. There are many stories about Christina I could bore you with, but by and large, we'll pass on that. And she'll be thankful for that too. The message with Christina, though, is clear, that I would like to introduce her with, is that get involved, folks. Central has a lot you can do. Inscape, radio, the Collegian, the Ragu, museums, sport teams, yes, choir, fellowship, you name it. If you think your sport's enough, it's not. If you think your high GPA is good enough, it's not. What really counts is getting involved in a lot of activities. Central provides the opportunity, can't force you to take advantage of those. So after all that, the speaker tonight is Christina Thompson-Schutt with her presentation, History Will Be Kind to Me, Thoughts on Museums, Silences, and the Power of Representation. Christina.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wiegers, for that wonderful introduction. Heck, I think I want to marry myself now. Like, that's so nice. It is a joy to be back on the Central Methodist campus this evening and to see so many friendly faces. I got the opportunity to talk with folks around campus today, and I love to just see my alma mater moving forward and moving ahead. It's incredible, and I love getting to meet so many students. I'd also like to thank Dr. Cherry for inviting me to deliver the Gaddis Lecture this evening, as well as President Drake for continuing this tradition. And then I'd like to acknowledge my spouse, John Shutt, who is with me tonight, for his constant support and encouragement of me and my work. And thank my mother, who is actually spending time with our 3-year-old this evening so that I could be here. And then finally, I'd like to thank the staff of the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center and the Department of Arkansas Heritage for allowing me the time to be here. The title from today's presentation comes from a quote by Winston Churchill. "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." I remembered first reading these words during my time here at Central when Dr. Wiegers and I were looking for quotes for our bulletin board to inspire and encourage history majors to take action and get involved in the field through presentations at professional conferences and in local history projects here in Fayette. At the time, most students didn't think that going to history conferences was for them, or even think of doing history work outside of teaching. Though, to be fair, I didn't think it was for me either. I only ended up presenting at a conference because of a serendipitous series of events, which began with me getting a D on my midterm grade freshman year in Bob Wiegers' World History course.
Never happened.
Joy Flanders, who had been my faculty member for orientation, suggested that I speak with Bob about the grade. Reluctantly, I did, and he offered me a few extra credit points if I helped him locate and photograph an armory for his book. I found the building, and he was impressed with my research skills, and so offered me a job as his research assistant. During that time, I was researching African-American Louisians involved with the Battle of New Orleans. When I showed Dr. Wiegers my final report, he suggested that I present it at the Missouri History Association annual meeting, to which I told him no, and that he was crazy for suggesting it. What he really meant was that he had already signed me up to present at the conference, and so I should just go ahead and go, since I had already done the research anyway. There were a lot of firsts for me at that conference. The first time presenting research, the first professional conference, but probably most important, the first time I had ever researched and really learned about Black history. You see, Black history was not, and in many cases is still not, taught in public schools or in museums across this country. But the problem with that, as Marcus Garvey has said, is that a people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And when I talk about knowing history, I don't just mean learning about slavery or Rosa Parks. Black history, all history, is much more robust and interesting than just a few key players or singular events. Where were the stories about the agency that Black women used to maintain the famous Montgomery bus boycott for 381 days? Or the story of how 2 former enslaved men founded an international organization to sell burial insurance during segregation? Or the stories of Black women who created profitable businesses during a time in which they could not legally vote? Or the story of Frank Embry, a man who was whipped, beaten, and lynched on June 17, 1899 in Fayette, Missouri? Where were the stories which gave my history context and depth of meaning? When we think of history, we often think of a passive place, a place in which we are distant travelers, purveying the scene of something long ago and forgotten, immovable by time. As S.E. Hinton wrote, "That was then, this is now." Before I worked in the museum, I was an archivist for a number of years. An archivist, according to the Society of American Archivists, is someone who is responsible for appraising, acquiring, arranging, describing, preserving, and providing access to records of enduring value according to the principles of provenance, original order, and collective control, to protect the material's authenticity and context. In short, archivists are often the collectors and keepers of history. We are the people and places that historians go to when they want to know about the primary sources of the past. One of my early experiences with archives came during an internship I had working at the Missouri State Archives, processing Missouri Supreme Court case files from the 1800s. I had gotten the position because of previous experience I had from working at the CMU archives, as well as the Jackson County Historical Society. My partner and I were responsible for processing the documents, which included light conservation work and inputting the relevant information into the Missouri Supreme Court Historical Database. There were a lot of interesting cases that we discovered, including a surprising number of claims involving farm animals and the railroad. At some point during the project, my partner and I realized that he was using the word steamship to describe a boat propelled by steam, and I was using the word steamboat. Now, this may seem like an inconsequential word in the grand scheme of the project until you realize that there were approximately 140 cases that had to deal with steam-powered vessels. We went back and forth for a while about how we should address this. Yet, I recalled my library training from working at Smiley Library and how useful Library of Congress subject headings were to organizing information using standardized taxonomy. I suggested to my partner that maybe instead of coming up with our own controlled vocabulary, we could use something that libraries around the country used, the Library of Congress subject headings. Now, while this may seem like a simple or esoteric problem, the experience taught me that language matters, and that archivists wield a considerable amount of influence over what words are used to describe something. In a more recent example, take the 2016 heated discussion between the Library of Congress, the library community, and the U.S. House of Representatives over changing the subject heading for illegal aliens to unauthorized immigration and non-citizen. Or take, for example, the ongoing problem of finding aids and library catalogs for non-English archival collections being only written in English instead of also being written in the language of the item's creator. So you see, words and the people who assign those words to objects have power. And while we frequently enjoy proclaiming our neutrality and objectivity at the work we do, the reality is that the archivist and archives are inherently biased. The historian Howard Zinn discovered this in the 1970s when he wrote, "The archivist, even more than the historian and the political scientist, tends to be scrupulous about his neutrality, to see his job as a technical job, free from the nasty world of political interest, a job of collecting, sorting, preserving, making available the records of a society. But I will stick by what I have said and argue that the archivist, in subtle ways, tends to perpetuate this political and economic status quo simply by going about his ordinary business. His supposed neutrality is, in other words, a fake." Take, for example, the Simpsons television show episode, in which Lisa Simpson accidentally learns by way of a missing silver tongue stolen by the curator of the Historical Society that the founder of Springfield was not a heroic frontiersman named Jebediah Obadiah Zechariah Springfield, but the pirate and enemy of George Washington, Hans Sprungfield. Or, as George Orwell has put it, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. The past is whatever the records and the memories agree upon, and since the party is in full control of all records and in equally full control of the minds of its members, it follows that the past is whatever the party chooses to make. In a profession which has long been dominated by one view of history, and historically by whites, it is little surprise that there was not an interest in keeping history that was not their own. Yet if we recall the earlier quote I gave by Churchill, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it," we could just as easily apply this quote not only to the creation of secondary sources to which Churchill referred, but to the primary sources as well. For it is not just the archivist who has decided on the past through their picking and choosing, but the people of history themselves, who have also decided which stories matter and in what ways they can be discussed. In Saidiya Hartman's article, Venus in Two Acts, she writes about the difficulty in deconstructing the narrative around enslaved African women, who were often only referred to as a commodity or by the violence perpetrated against them. To her, the archive is a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, and asterisks in the grand narrative of history. The central question she grapples with is how do we begin to understand the life of enslaved or oppressed people, the silences which are rampant in the historical record when we are bound by what can be found in the archive. It's a question that we grapple with daily at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, where we seek to not define someone's life to a singular moment in history. Take, for example, John Carter. According to numerous newspaper accounts, on April 30th, 1927, the dead body of a 12-year-old white girl named Floella McDonald was found by the janitor in the belfry of a local church in Little Rock. The next day, police arrested the janitor and his son, Lonnie Dixon, for the murder, and fearing the outrage present in the city, sent both men to a jail in Texarkana about 3 hours away from Little Rock. Yet tensions surrounding the murder remained high in Little Rock, and on May 4th, an armed posse found 38-year-old John Carter, whom they accused of assaulting a white woman and her daughter. They hanged him from a telephone pole and shot him to death at the corner of 9th and Broadway, at the site of where the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center is located, and historically the heart of Black business and community life in Little Rock. Approximately 5,000 white people who witnessed and participated in the mob violence rioted the area, including taking neighboring church pews to use for fuel at a bonfire, at which they set Carter's body ablaze. At one point, the white mob used Carter's charred and torn off arm to direct traffic with. The next day, a young white boy was found selling pictures of Carter's body as souvenirs for 15 cents a copy. Now, while this event was particularly heinous, I worry that we will continue to define John Carter by this singular moment in time. What about his family? Did he have children? A wife? Siblings? Where did he work? What happened to his family after his death? While violence may have been the point of entry for the narrative of his life, how do we keep from continually assaulting his body by defining our view of him through the eyes of those who violated it in the first place? And if we think that museums are neutral places whereby we simply display the facts of history, we may find that many are just as culpable in the silencing of history. How often, when we go to museums, do we see people or objects from communities which are not white, educated, English-speaking, heterosexual, gender-normative, able-bodied, or with class privilege? Or do we even expect to see those things? Have we become so conditioned to white privilege, the transparent preference for whiteness, which permeates society and creates advantages for some in subtle, insidious, and normative ways, that we don't question when there are people of color on museum governing boards, in leadership roles at institutions, or in the galleries of museums? When we're talking about inventors or writers or creating art exhibitions or designing our course syllabus, how often do we think about visibly diversifying the stories present in the room? Do we even acknowledge that the room is big enough for all of us? Or do we relegate ethnic and gender histories to be celebrated in the month that is designated for them? I once got a call from a teacher who was upset that the museum couldn't accommodate her class for an outreach program during Black History Month in February because we were already overbooked in programs and tours. I explained that we would be happy to visit her class in March, but she insisted that the only time she could make space for Black history was in February. In his remarks at the opening of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, President Barack Obama made mention of a museum artifact, a stone with a plaque to Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, who spoke from this slave block in 1830. He says, "I want you to think about this. Consider what this artifact tells us about history, and about how it's told, and about what can be cast aside. On a stone where day after day, for years, men and women were torn from their spouse or their child, shackled and bound, and bought and sold, and bid like cattle. On a stone worn down by the tragedy of over 1,000 bare feet. For a long time, the only thing we considered important, the singular thing we once chose to commemorate as history with a plaque, were the unmemorable speeches of two powerful men." You see, in some ways, it's easy to only celebrate the accomplishments of some, such as the unremarkable speech of Jackson and Clay, or to think of history as uncomplicated. After all, if history is uncomplicated, then we don't have to grapple with the complicated persona of people like Thomas Jefferson, who would write that all men are created equal while also owning over 600 slaves. In some ways, the injustice of the slave auction block is not just that it was saved because of a speech by two powerful men, but because of the countless other items that weren't saved because their only provenance or claim to fame was that it was black used. For too long, items used and in some cases owned by African Americans were not deemed worthy to be in the halls of museums or were relegated to the basements of large institutions who struggled for ways in which to present the African American lens. As Jeanette Bastian, former director of the Territorial Library for the U.S. Virgin Islands, has observed, a community without its records is a community under siege, defending itself, its identity, and its version of history without a firm foundation on which to stand. Take, for example, events of police violence across this country, or closer to home in Ferguson, Missouri. It is difficult to understand the deaths of Michael Brown or Anthony Lamar Smith without also understanding the Dred Scott case, decades of housing discrimination, racial profiling, militarized police response in the 1960s, or white flight from the city center. So, what now? How do we begin to dismantle and then rebuild institutions and a history which has been built around exclusion and silencing of the narrative? After all, as Audre Lorde has said, without community, there is no liberation. Only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never allow us to bring about genuine change. Maybe the first step is to truthfully acknowledge and learn about the painful past that has brought us to this point. Begin by accepting that this country was built on the backs of people of color, that the wealth and prosperity that many of us enjoy today would not have been possible without black and brown bodies. And for once, stop telling the lie that according to a 2011 Pew Research study, that 48% of Americans believe that the U.S. Civil War was fought over states' rights. If the war was fought over states' rights, it was fought for a state's rights to keep their slaves. This year at the museum, we're going through an interpretive planning process. Interpretive planning for museums is the process by which cultural institutions decide on the overarching narrative and themes by which exhibitions and programs are built around. At one point, we had a discussion on how to talk about the prison system and its ugly history in re-enslaving blacks following the Civil War. In 1902, the state of Arkansas purchased 10,000 acres of land from Cummings and Maple Grove plantations, which they then turned into prison farms. Inmates on these prison farms were expected to work picking cotton and getting crops, much like the enslaved before them, and were overseen by trustees, also called inmate guards. It was not uncommon for black men to be picked up on erroneous loitering charges and sentenced to work at essentially a plantation. And while we debated on how we wanted to physically present a system which disproportionately biases African Americans, the thing we all agreed on was that we should just tell the truth. For museums, truth-telling must not only be grounded in the stories and oral narratives that we tell, but the objects as well. We recently opened a new exhibition at the Mosaic Temperance Cultural Center titled Hidden No More. This exhibit focuses on little-known aspects of black history through different entry points. One of my favorite pieces in the exhibition is a photograph of the gospel singing group, the Loving Sisters, who produced 10 albums, including one which garnered a Grammy nomination. Now, what people may not know is that these women also marched with Dr. King. Or take, for example, the Hathaways, Isaac and his wife Umer, both of whom were artists. Isaac was the first African American to design a coin for the U.S. Mint, and the first to feature an African American, Booker T. Washington, in a coin design. Isaac began a career in sculpture work Because when he looked at statues of great men, he did not see notable African Americans represented. One of my favorite Doc R-isms from my time at Central was that your mind is like your living room. You should fill it with lots of good things, like art and literature and good people. When we think about our own living rooms, what kinds of things and people is it filled with? I recently had the opportunity to visit the National Museum of Mexican Art in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. The museum is an incredible showcase of Mexican art that the museum describes as sin fronteras, without borders, which evokes the multifaceted and diverse nature of Mexican identity. I particularly enjoy seeing work by the Yo Cali Teen Program, which displayed protest posters that intersected art, history, and relevancy. One of my favorite posters from the exhibit reads, "It was never about bathrooms, just like it was never about water fountains." Or my other favorite, equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. It's not pizza. In her book, The Art of Relevance, Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History Director Nina Simon writes, "Anytime you look at an organization and think, they've gone too far, they ought not to do that, it's worth asking yourself why. It's rare that an entity adds something to their programming that is so divergent and so powerful that it injures other aspects of the institution. It may injure your idea of that institution, but it's worth asking whether it really injures the entity itself. Is the room still intact? Is there still a place for you in it? That's what matters." So I ask, when you look around at the people in your living room, who are they? Are they only people who represent your identity, values, and experience? When you think about the books you've read or included on the reading list of your 4 syllabus, are the only names on that list Shakespeare, Chaucer, Adam Smith, or Immanuel Kant? Or do you include works by James Baldwin, Octavia Butler, Audre Lorde, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or W.E.B. Du Bois? One of the easiest ways to have more voices in the room is to look around at the table and see who is not at the table, and then use your privileged seat to do something about it. At the museum, we've been trying to practice this through #InclusiveArkansas, an initiative which is all about making our museum more welcoming to people with disabilities. I'd like to show you a brief video about our Inclusive Arkansas initiative. Here at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, it's important to us that we be a museum for all Arkansans. Inclusive Arkansas really is about making museums welcoming for all people. I think a lot of times people don't implement accessibility or think about accessibility because we don't think about it as being something we need. But what we found is that there are often a lot of low-cost things that you can do, and the biggest thing that we've discovered is that just listening to people and asking what do they need, how can we enhance their museum experience and truly make it the best one for them and their families.
It's very important because there are people with disabilities, especially visual impairments, who may think of museums as being boring places because they really can't see the things that are in the museums.
So some of the ways that we implement Inclusive Arkansas here at the museum, we have different touch tables that people can interact with that allow them to interact with content in a way where if they're not someone who reads English, they can interact through visual stimulation on our touch tables. We also have earmuffs for folks that might have sensitivity to echoing or sound issues, magnifying sheets, which have been really helpful for some of our elderly visitors who maybe have low sight or low vision.
We found that this was very interactive for our daughter. The fact that she was able to interact with the table, bringing up information on different historical figures, made it extremely easy for someone with her limitations to participate in.
I firmly believe in being able to touch as many things as possible. It's great when you're a young child and you can come to the museum and you can touch something, you can touch history and you can feel history. So a lot of the inclusivity and accessibility features that we have added to the museum and that we'll continue to add to the museum are all about reinforcing that concept and that core principle that we truly are a museum for all of Arkansas. You see, when I looked around the room, I noticed that museums weren't always inviting to people with disabilities. We tell people, don't touch, don't yell, don't, etc., etc. And while we thought we were just protecting the object, keeping order, or whatever other reason we came up with, what we were really doing is saying that you weren't welcome at the museum. Now, while I didn't grow up under legalized segregation, I did grow up knowing what it was like to be excluded and to be told that the very things that made me me weren't welcome. So when I became director of the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center at 29 years old, the first thing I did was say that this museum was going to be a museum that's open and inviting to all Arkansans. My staff and I talked to experts in Arkansas about our ideas and ways we could change, whether it be painting the walls to reduce sensory stimulation and aid those with low vision in reading labels, to providing activity options when we have educational programming, to buying gluten-free cookies so that everyone felt thought of and appreciated. As Australian author Bo Taplin has observed, whoever said the small things don't matter has never seen a match start a wildfire. When I remember my childhood growing up in Kansas City, some of my most fond memories were around the table at my grandmother's house. She would cook these amazing meals which brought family and friends over to eat and to be part of the fellowship around the table. No matter how many people sat at her table, there was always an abundance of food. I asked once how it was that she could feed 20, 30, sometimes 50 people in her small home, and she just said that there was always room for one more at her table. She understood that the table is big enough for everyone. I'd like to conclude tonight's lecture with words by Audre Lorde from a paper she delivered at the Modern Language Association meeting in 1977. I first heard these words at a time in which I was desperate to find my voice in the space between the now and the not yet of history and the present circumstances of my own narrative. Lorde says, "For to survive in this mouth of this dragon we call America, we have had to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive. And that visibility, which makes us most vulnerable, is that which also is the source of our greatest strength. Because the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners, mute forever, while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners, mute as bottles, and we will still be no less afraid. The fact that we are here and that I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken." Thank you. I hear that people get extra credit if they ask a question. That's what Dr. Bradley said, so you're in his class. But yeah, if you have questions or want a dialogue, I'd love for that. Oh, yes.
So how might someone, a student, or anyone who's in a participation here today, find their own voice in their own narrative?
I love that. I love this idea of exploring, of discovering. So I'm going to brag on Dr. Bradley. So he told me once, I was in his class and I was really frustrated about my grade and learning stuff, and I don't know, I just couldn't get a good grade in his class, and I was really annoyed about it. And he said something to me. He said, you know, everybody who's ever done anything in life has learned it themselves. They've taken some initiative, right, to learn something and to learn about themselves, right? And so a big part of that, right, is going out and learning, you know, looking at your major, right, looking at maybe your biology major and saying, I wonder if there are any biologists who look like me. Can I go out and find them, right? Or maybe there aren't. Maybe you don't know any, but it's then going there and saying, I need to learn everything I can, so then the person who comes behind me will then go and say, hey, this person showed me, right? So it's that learning, it's that building community in that space in which to dialogue, right? That's a big part of it. And then it's also looking around at your friends And so, we have a lot of students here, which is awesome that so many came. But it's looking at your friends and saying, hey, help me, I want to learn more about you, right? I want to learn more about your history. I want to learn more about where you come from, because we all have stories. One of the neat things about my job is I get to hear people's stories from all over Arkansas, and that's really cool. And it's really interesting to hear people's stories because you learn so much about them, and you learn about their life when you sit and have that dialogue. And that's a big part of how my own sort of exploration happened, in addition to, taking a little initiative and saying, I'm going to learn something. I'm going to take charge of my education. What other questions do you have? Yeah.
What part of Kansas City are you from?
So I went to Park Hill South High School. Yeah. My family lives like in Riverside. So part of my family, I grew up there, but my grandmother lives just south of the plaza off of 43rd Street. So I'm a Royals fan, true blue. So excellent. What else? Yeah.
Tell me about the part that Central Methodist played in the expectations of your life. Before you came to Central Methodist, did you think that you would one day have your own museum? What were your expectations before you came here? Did we do anything to help reshape them?
Yeah. So I'm so grateful for my Central education. I only ended up here by sort of happenstance. I was at a college fair, and I was determined I was going to go to KU, and I was going to be an architect, even though I'm terrible at math. And I can't measure anything to save my life. Asked my husband, everything's crooked in our house. But I knew I was going to be a historical architect. And the Central Methodist table at the college fair just happened to be next to the KU table. And my mother got talking to the person at CMU, and she was just telling her about the college. My mom said, oh, look at this school, it seems really nice. And I was like, yeah, whatever. I'm going to be a Jayhawk. Even though I'm from Kansas City, I was like, I'm going to be a Jayhawker. So, and then I got this letter in the mail from the admissions person, and it just said, it was so nice to meet you, and if you ever have questions about college, we'd be happy to talk to you, even if you don't want to go to Central. I just want you to know that you have a resource there. And I was really impressed by that. I thought, wow, someone took the time to send me a handwritten note. What kind of place is this? And so I came down to visit on campus, and I fell in love with the campus and the people here. And I thought, maybe I'll go here for a couple of years, and maybe I'll transfer somewhere else. And then I got involved on campus, and I started getting to know other students, and I started doing theater productions. And then I met Dr. Wiegers, and then he got me involved in a bunch of stuff. And then I realized that everything I ever needed was here. I didn't need to go to some other school to get that. I could get it here, right? I could take part in my own narrative, my own history, and take part in my own education, which is something that I had never really gotten the opportunity before, right? When you're in high school, they tell you what to do, right? You're practicing for those standardized tests. That's what they tell you need to know. Versus at Central, I got the opportunity to explore my own. And the faculty were just like, okay, let's support that, right? Let's encourage that. You want to learn about something? Let's encourage that. I remember we had Hebrew for a semester because myself and a couple other students went to Dr. Jeffries and were like, hey, this might be interesting. He was like, all right, let's do a class on Hebrew. And so we did. My Hebrew is terrible. I can remember like 2 words out of the alphabet, but it was a really awesome class. And again, it was a great opportunity for me really to design and think about holistically my experience. One of the things I was sharing with somebody earlier today was about this idea of that liberal arts experience that you get, where you get that one-on-one time with faculty, where you get to participate in research. You don't get that at big places. I've worked at, Dr. Wiegers mentioned, I've worked at some big name places. They don't do that with their undergraduate students. They don't, at all. You might be a senior if you're lucky and you know somebody. They don't do that kind of stuff for undergraduates. And so to be a sophomore and to be presented at a conference, that's huge. And that was something that really told me that, hey, I could do something, right? I can be something. I can do something with my life. And again, coming from a place where, my high school guidance counselor didn't even think I was going to go to college. She was surprised when I filled out the college application. and took an ACT, because that's what you do when you're preparing to go to college. And so to go from that to going to a place where people, anyway, I don't want to get emotional, but to go to a place where people believe in you is incredible. Yeah.
What was the biggest setback in your career and how did you overcome it?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I have a hard time thinking of that, right? And not because I don't think of things as setbacks. So moving to New Orleans, like right after there was a hurricane, maybe not the smartest idea. I had to like track down a mailman, right, to mail letters. I mean, basic services were not quite up and functioning in that city at that point. But I learned so much about myself, right? That was the first time for me that I had ever moved and lived somewhere on my own away from my family. Other than, I'm from Kansas City, I'm 2 hours from home. My grandmother used to send me ribs on the weekends, right? And so moving to New Orleans, right, it felt like a setback at times, right? I was alone in the city. I had to do it on my own. I had to make it happen. My mom was like, if you want to do this, hey, if you want to do this as a career, you need to make it happen. I'm not going to support you. If you think you can be an archivist and get paid to do that, great. But good luck with that. Right? She was hoping I would be a lawyer or a doctor or something more sensible. But, it really gave me that kick that I needed to say, okay, I got to make it happen, right? Because it's just me. And so, it's hard for me to think of those things as setbacks, though, right? Because I think in any experience, no matter how negative it is, like, there's still positive to be learned, right? I learned that I could live on my own. It gave me the courage I needed to apply for a graduate program that I thought to myself I had no, chance in getting in, and then I got in, right? But I never would have applied if I didn't know that I could do it, that I could live on my own and be successful. Yeah.
Hearing about silence, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So you know what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
I've never heard that until about 10 years ago when I lived here. I grew up all my high school years in Tulsa, and that was never said or mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, so what she's referring to, Tulsa, between about 1917 till 1921, what they sort of term as Red Summers, there were basically race massacres is a more appropriate term. A lot of times riots used, but it was really massacre across the country and across the South. Arkansas had one in Phillips County, which the museum is actually in the process of doing some remembrance stuff for that. But Tulsa had one, and actually they have a great exhibit at the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture about Tulsa, which I think is great. But one of the reasons that oftentimes those things aren't talked about is because nobody wants to talk about them, right? No one wants to acknowledge, that's part of that history being so close to us, right? Past this prologue. And so it's difficult for people to talk about it. Even, something that happened for many people before their lifetime, right? It may have been their parents or whatever that knew about it. But things like that are difficult to talk about, but that makes it much more important that we talk about it. Because part of the problem, one of the things that, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, but one of the things that I've firmly believed and I am underscored every day when I go to work is that the reason we have race problems in this country is because we never talk about it. We never just acknowledge that, hey, we have a problem, we should do something about it. Instead, we try and hide it under the rug. We try and not talk about it. We try and talk around it. We try and make it about something that it's not even about, right? We try and make it about who's more American and who's not American, right? Instead of talking about the issues at hand. Right, instead of talking about whatever that issue is for the community. And so because the U.S. as a country has struggled to do any serious reconciliation, truth and reconciliation work, you see it happen sometimes in communities, right? And they're successful and they're able to move on as a community, right? To move beyond, to remember that event, but then to move on. But again, because we don't deal with that as a country as a whole, that's why we have problems. I mean, you look at things like Confederate memorials and people getting all up in arms about Confederate memorials. Most of those memorials were put in, they're revisionist history. Most of them were put in, right, as the Southern Democrats come back into power under Wilson, or put in again during and after the passage the Brown v. Board decision, right? That's when most of those memorials come into play. They're a reaction. There's a great book if you want to read more about it, and I'm going to forget the author's name, but the title of the book is called White Rage. And the author in it argues that every time that African Americans have made strides in this country or moved forward, that it's not so much that there's more black violence, but in fact what's going on is it's this white rage response to it, of people basically reacting to that. There's also a new book that's coming out, I forget the title of the book, but it's by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's coming out, I think this year, which talks specifically about that. He just did a great piece for The Atlantic called The First White President, which talks specifically about this issue, about America's refusal to do something about and acknowledge its very tumultuous and difficult history. So. Other questions?
2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Looked it up.
Oh, okay, great. I'm not a librarian anymore, so I miss these things. Other questions? That was great. Yeah.
As you were making the museum more inclusive, do you find anything that we could implement at CMU that would be beneficial for us?
Oh, that's awesome. That's a great question. So one of the simple things that we did, or that we do now, that we didn't do, was we tell people what they're eating. And so you would be surprised how many people have food allergies. And that's something that I found is pretty, like I said, there's lots of people. I guarantee there's probably somebody in this room that has a food allergy or food sensitivity. And so we started labeling the food that we have at our events. So we just tell people what's in it. And it's just simple, it's on the card, it's nothing fancy. But when people look at the food, they know if there's meat, some of the 7 common food allergens, if those things are on the menu. So that's something that's, right, it's pretty simple for us to do, and it's not an added thing to do that. Also letting people know sometimes the menu ahead of time can be really helpful, so then they can choose what they want to eat. Haben Gurma, who's a disability rights advocate, has a great story that she always tells about how she's blind and deaf. And so she couldn't read the menu, right? They would send her the menu, all she wanted was for them to send her the menu, and she has a screen reader, right? She could read it. But the college would never send her the menu ahead of time. And she kept going, she kept asking and asking, and it would never do it. And then, and part of her taking charge of her own education, she said, all right, I'm gonna learn about this. And so she learned about things like the ADA, and she learned about the requirements, right, that businesses have to operate. And she went to the dining services director and she said, look, you're gonna have a real problem, like a lawsuit on your hands if you don't do this. And so then they started sending her the menus. But it's thinking about those things ahead of time. And then asking people. Sometimes the easiest things is just to ask people, what would be helpful to you? What would be, how can I be empathetic to you? How can I, it's sort of like, who is my neighbor, right? Or, if you think about Mr. Rogers, right? What would Mr. Rogers do? That's sometimes it sounds sort of off, sort of joking. We watch a lot of Mr. Rogers in our house. But that's one of the things we think about, right? Because he was always thinking about his neighbor. He was thinking about how could he be kind to his neighbor? How could he help someone else? So, yeah, great question. Yeah.
Real quickly, your outreach, you're trying to get the Black community to come into their own museum to learn about Black history. Mm-hmm. How to get the other side to come into your museum to learn about Black history?
Well, the thing I always say is, so I sort of hashtag it, right? Black history is our history, so it's our history and Arkansas history, right? So you can't understand Arkansas history without understanding Black history. If you don't know about, people like the Mosaic Templars, right, who had a pharmacy, who operated the first Black hospital, which they built next door to our building, next door to our museum building. If you don't know those things, right, you're missing? You're missing the richness and the beauty of Arkansas history. We did a great exhibit last year in the fall about farming. Agriculture is a big industry. It's the biggest industry we have in Arkansas. And I learned when we did that about that they used to actually have a segregated extension service, which I didn't know. And so I got to learn a little history myself. But the Southern Tenement Farmers Union, which was the first agricultural union in the country, was founded by Black farmers in Arkansas, right? So if you want to learn about Union history, right? Unionizing history, how are you going to learn that if you don't learn about those black farmers? You're missing a huge gap in history. And that's part of it, right? That's not just black history, right? It's everyone's history. I mean, that's part of the issue, right? It's having room for everyone, right? I don't want to, when I go to museums, you know, yes, when I went to Chicago, I went to the DeSable, right? Because I'm a Black History Museum director. I want to see what other black museums do. But I also went to the National Museum of Mexican Art, and I was blown away. And I found connection points, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all our story, right? We're all impacted by each other. We're all better for being in community together. And until we learn that, you know, that hard truth about life, like, we'll never get better as a community. But it's learning that, you know, there is no us and them. Like, we've gotten in our world into this idea of it's us versus them, you versus me. I can't succeed if you succeed, right? And that's the furthest thing from the truth, right? We all do better. When one person does better, we all do better. Right? When my neighbor succeeds, when my neighbor is happy and has his lawn cut, right? Then I don't have to worry about random animals scavenging my lawn, right? It helps everybody. But we don't think about the world in that way, which is sad. I mean, more people could do with having more liberal arts style education and more well-rounded education in this world, frankly. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I applaud the direction in which we're taking. For so long, it seemed that African American history was about people who were in the civil rights movement and black sports stars, and that's all you've heard. For years in the business program, we've shown for Black History Month a video on black entrepreneurs with stories that are amazing. It is now so outdated that I can't find anything to replace it. But the stories of blacks who faced all these limits on what they could do, but who persevered nonetheless and made great contributions, are the kind of stories that we need to hear alongside of all of those others. And so this kind of museum, I think, is absolutely wonderful for telling those kinds of stories.
Thank you so much. There's a podcast NPR is doing about entrepreneurs, and they've been pretty good about interviewing kind of just a diverse group of entrepreneurs. I listened to a great piece by Lisa Price, who was a black woman who invented Carol's Daughters, the hair care product, of which I'm a huge fan. And so, kind of on the side there. But they had a great podcast where they talked about how she built her business, like literally from her kitchen sink. And people used to call her home, and she would make products for the week, and she talks about that. But yeah, NPR has been doing this great podcast series. I can't think of the name of it, I'm sorry, right off the top, but they've been doing a great podcast series on entrepreneurs. But yeah, it's one of those things where you have to be intentional, and you have to look, and and I think it's great that you were showing the video to encourage people, you know, that you can do it too. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you all again for having me. I appreciate it.